In the 1960s, American producer Henry G. Saperstein partnered with Toho, funding half of 3 monster movies and aiming to make them more appealing to North American audiences. The idea was to make the pacing faster and to add in American actor Nick Adams. One of these 3 movies was Invasion of the Astro Monster, or as it was released in the West, Monster Zero. And this marked the very first time that an American studio was heavily involved in the creation of a Godzilla movie. The usual suspects were brought in to work on it. The film was directed by Ishiro Honda. Eiji Tsuburaya acted as the special effects director, Akira Ifukube composed the score, and yet again Haruo Nakajima donned the Godzilla suit. Masaki Shinohara portrayed Rodan, and Shoichi Hirose played the villainous 3-headed monster King Ghidorah. The majority of the cast for Invasion of the Astro Monster were Toho usuals that had already appeared in kaiju films prior, like Akira Takarada, Kumi Mizuno, and Jun Tazaki. Teizo Toshimitsu designed Godzilla's new suit, making several notable changes, like the softened dorsal plates and the eyes being much bigger. The pupils also had the ability to go back and forth, which made the suit more expressive. The Rodan and King Ghidorah suits were just recycled and reused from Ghidorah the 3-headed monster, but they had some minor updates here and there, like Ghidorah's suit being a bit darker and Rodan's suit was slimmed down to be a little bit more sleek. It was the 9th highest grossing film of that year, and it's a fan favorite among the Godzilla fans, despite Godzilla's lack of screen time, which is something that we'll get into later. However, I noticed something kind of odd. Invasion of the Astro Monster bears a striking aesthetic similarity to the original run of Star Trek. James Rolfe first pointed this out in his Monster Madness Godzillathon series.
And that's kind of how this feels, like a Star Trek episode with a little bit of Godzilla thrown in. But just for the record, this came out first.
A small but vocal group of Godzilla fans have suggested that Star Trek might have ripped off Invasion of the Astro Monster. At a glance, this theory seems very plausible since this film predates Star Trek by about a year. However, I think it's a bit of a stretch. Invasion of the Astro Monster was released a year prior to Star Trek, but Monster Zero wasn't released in America until the early 1970s, well after Star Trek had premiered on TV. This makes it very unlikely that the show's creators would have seen the film in Japanese theaters before launching Star Trek. Still, it's easy to understand why fans would draw parallels. Both Astro Monster and Star Trek epitomize the distinctive visual style and speculative tone of the 1960s and their sci-fi romps, with sleek spaceships, futuristic sets, and exploration of interplanetary relations. It's less about one copying the other, and more a shared reflection of the era's imagination about space and extraterrestrial life. Personally, as a fan of both Star Trek and Godzilla, I think that it's a win-win. It's like that one meme where the guy's like, oh boy, 2 cakes. So, let's get into it. This is Invasion of the Astro Monster. Really quick, today's video is sponsored by me. I'm going to use this opportunity to plug my short films and feature films. For those that may not know, I am a filmmaker first and foremost, and I have made several kaiju projects. My biggest project right now is the WAMD universe, which is made up of a bunch of short films and a feature-length kaiju movie called The Anomalous Archives. If you like horror movies or Godzilla films or even just analog horror in general, then this might be for you. Join the channel as a member and you can see some exclusive behind the scenes content that no one else has access to unless you're a member. That's it. In the year 1960X, astronauts Glenn and Fuji are sent by the World Space Agency to explore the newly discovered planet X, which is beyond Jupiter. Meanwhile, on Earth, Fuji's sister, Haruno, is dating an inventor named Tetsuo Tori, who hopes to win Fuji's approval by selling his Lady Guard alarm to a toy company represented by Namikawa. On Planet X, Fuji finds human-like footprints and discovers Glenn missing. He follows an elevator underground, where he reunites with Glenn and meets the controller of Planet X. They learn that the planet is plagued by King Ghidorah, whom the controller calls Monster Zero. The controller controller requests to borrow Earth's monsters, Godzilla and Rodan, to fight off Ghidorah, offering a cure for cancer in exchange. Glenn and Fuji agree to bring the offer to Earth, though they are suspicious of the Exilians' intentions. On Earth, they realize that the Exilians are already active there, raising further doubts. Soon, Godzilla and Rodan are taken to Planet X, where they force Ghidorah to retreat after a very lengthy battle. Glenn and Fuji, meanwhile, explore the Exilian complex, uncovering secrets about their society, including its strict computer-based control and hidden gold reserves. Glenn also notices that all of the Exilian women look like Namikawa, who he's been dating throughout the film. Back on Earth, the Exilians reveal their true plan: to control Godzilla, Rodan, and Ghidorah to conquer Earth unless humanity surrenders. Glenn confronts Namikawa, who admits that she's an alien but loves him. After she's executed for defiance, she leaves Glenn a note hinting at the Exilian weakness to a certain sound frequency. Tetsuo realizes that this frequency matches his Lady Guard alarm. Fuji, Glenn, and Tetsuo use the alarm to disrupt the Exilian invasion, freeing Godzilla and Rodan from the aliens' mind control. The monsters fight Ghidorah in an epic clash that ends with the three-headed monster retreating into space. The first thing I noticed while revisiting this movie is that Akira Takarada and Nick Adams have fantastic chemistry, and it's one of the film's standout features. Adams, playing Glenn, carries the film as the kind of protagonist that you can really get behind.
You have something else to do?
Actually, I'm waiting for someone myself. We're going on a drive.
Nick Adams' decision to speak English throughout the film initially feels kind of jarring because everyone else in the cast is speaking Japanese, but as the film progresses, it really works, mainly in the emotional scenes between Glenn and Namikawa.
Because if we don't find a solution to this thing, happiness in this world ain't gonna be worth a hill of beans, you hear?
Had Adams been stumbling through lines in a language that he didn't know, it could have been disastrous, but instead, his natural charisma carries the role. A notable moment is the first on-screen kiss in a Godzilla movie, and it's a significant one, between a white man and an Asian woman, which was surprisingly progressive for 1965. It's a small but powerful detail that demonstrates the film's willingness to push boundaries. In a way, Glenn feels like the Captain Kirk to Fuji's Spock, with their dynamic echoing the Star Trek duo. Fuji, played by Takarada, feels a bit more one-dimensional. At the film's start, his primary motivation revolves around his sister back on Earth, as well as his generic astronaut duties, but honestly, it's the relationship between him and Glenn that elevates Fuji's role and gives him more depth than he might have had otherwise. The Exilians, on the other hand, are a perfect fit for what Invasion of the Astro Monster aims to accomplish. They are peak 1960s sci-fi, from their iconic visors to their color schemes. Their presence oozes retrofuturism. The set design in particular is impeccable. It embraces the era's vision of the future, which is both charming and nostalgic. Weird because I wasn't even alive in the 60s, but something about it just feels so right. That said, the reveal of the Exilian's true nature is a bit predictable, especially since the audience is kind of already primed for their villainy. While this is the first Godzilla movie with humanoid aliens in it, you're already expecting, like, yeah, they're going to be evil. That's the twist. It honestly might have even been more effective if the Exilians had been allies to Earth, united in a common goal to defeat King Ghidorah. Think, at first, the humans believe that they might be threats, and then it's revealed, no, like, we're here to actually help. And I think that would have been a very unique twist. I'm just picturing in my brain, like, the saucers coming down, and then the humans are ready for war, and the whole movie, you think that this is what the movie's going to be. It's going to be aliens and King Ghidorah versus Godzilla and humanity alongside Rodan. But regardless, that's just fan fiction at this point. These are incredibly memorable villains. They are cold, calculating, and menacing. Yoshio Tsuchiya's portrayal of the controller of Planet X is chilling. Even in moments of apparent civility, his demeanor is so alien and unsettling that you can't help but be drawn into his presence. A common complaint about this film is that Godzilla doesn't get enough screen time. It's true. This movie holds the record for the least amount of Godzilla footage in the entire franchise, with the King of the Monsters only appearing on screen for 5 minutes and 43 seconds. But Here's the thing, those few moments are impactful. The film doesn't squander Godzilla's appearances. Each one builds the anticipation for the big showdown. It's not about how much time he's on screen, but how effectively that time is used. If Godzilla had shown up at the end and only at the end, then that would have been a huge problem, but instead, he's peppered throughout the film in strategic moments. Compare that to Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, where kaiju don't appear until the halfway point in the movie. Ugh. The pacing in Invasion of the Astro Monster is much tighter and more focused. While some Godzilla fans often gripe about the human-centered storylines, Astro Monster manages to strike the right balance, keeping the drama centered around the monsters and the aliens. The mystery surrounding Planet X is really what keeps you hooked. One aspect of the film that I'm not a big fan of, though it's not really a deal breaker, is the use of stock footage. Invasion of the Astro Monster marks the first major instance of Toho relying heavily on pre-existing footage, pulling from films like Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Rodan, The Mysterians, and Mothra. They did this to cut corners during some of the kaiju destruction scenes. While it doesn't feel as excessive as later films in the series, like 1969's Godzilla's Revenge or 1973's Godzilla vs. Megalon, it's definitely a sign of things to come. It doesn't ruin the movie by any means, but it's worth noting for those who keep an eye on these type of things. Getting back to the positives though, Akira Ifukube's score is fantastic, as always. The theremin-heavy space themes, especially during the Planet X sequences, give the film this eerie, otherworldly atmosphere. It toes the line between campy 1950s B-movie vibes and genuinely effective sci-fi music, and somehow it works perfectly. It's not just nostalgic, it enhances the film's atmosphere in the best way possible. Beyond that, though, his more standard compositions are phenomenal. The main title music would eventually go on to be reused and repurposed in countless other Godzilla movies as a military march of sorts. The model work, suitmation, and general practical effects in Invasion of the Astro Monster are top-notch, though slightly less intricate than what we saw in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, but still, that's like, a major jump. The miniatures in that movie are downright phenomenal, but the craftsmanship is still impressive. As for Rodan, in case you haven't noticed, I'm just talking about him now. He's technically in the film, but he doesn't really add much to the action. His role is more about supporting Godzilla in the battle against Ghidorah, but he doesn't get a chance to shine in his own right. Still, his inclusion adds some fun to the spectacle, but the standout moment of the film is, of course, Godzilla's iconic dance after defeating Ghidorah on Planet X.
A happy moment.
However, this was a creative decision that director Ishiro Honda absolutely hated with a burning passion. He was already upset at the idea of Godzilla being more lighthearted, as evident in the making of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, but this really felt like it was a breaking point for Honda, who would work on other non-Godzilla kaiju movies after the release of Astro Monster. We'll get to more of that behind-the-scenes drama when the time comes, but I found this quote from Ryuji Honda, the son of Ishiro Honda, who said the following: "When they made Godzilla do that she thing, I knew how pissed my father was. He didn't say a word, but he was beyond angry. My father found it humiliating. I'm sure he was telling himself, we did not create Godzilla for that. It is not right." It's one of those moments, though, that has just become synonymous with Godzilla. It's random, but it works. It's a bit absurd, but it also fits the playful side of the character. While I personally love it as a fan, I can completely understand why Honda hated this decision and would ultimately leave the franchise for a bit. The original 1954 Godzilla film was just so dark and serious, while Astro Monster officially jumped the shark. Ironic when you consider the films that we haven't covered yet. In the US, Invasion of the Astro Monster was released under the title Monster Zero, and it was a double feature with War of the Gargantuas, a film that I already covered on this channel. Regardless, the English dub of Monster Zero is surprisingly great. It helps that Nick Adams didn't need his lines dubbed since he just spoke English on set. In general, the dub is about a minute and a half shorter than the original Japanese version, with a surprising amount of alterations being made in those 90 seconds. Most of which, though, are just changes to the dialogue. Overall, though, this is an extremely faithful dub that is on par with the original Japanese version of the film. My only real gripe was Sam Edwards' performance as Tetsuo. It was super cartoony and over-exaggerated. Like, I get the character's supposed to be a giant dweeb, like that's the point, but if the nerd emoji had a voice, it would be this performance.
Your brother thinks I'm a failure. I wish he were here so I could tell him about the $100,000.
Looking at all the other international releases, Invasion of the Astro Monster shockingly wasn't released in the UK until 1990. This version was a different English dub of the film that didn't really make any alterations to the film itself. The only changes were audio only. Astro Monster was released in West Germany in the 60s under the rather generic title, Command from the Dark. That specific version was a hodgepodge of other random Toho movies getting cut and spliced together. For example, bits and pieces of Atragon were inserted into Command from the Dark. Even then, it's still around 13 minutes shorter than the Japanese version. Huge chunks of the final battle between Godzilla and Rodan fighting King Ghidorah were removed, while a ton of dialogue was shortened and simplified. Instead of being named Planet X, the characters in the film call it Alpha 707. The Exilians are renamed to the Alphas. Other lines of dialogue imply that this film is the very first instance of humanity encountering giant monsters, meaning that Godzilla 54 is not canon to the West Germany version of this movie. Another version of the film was released in Lebanon under the name King Kong 2000, while the Brazilian release was known as The War of the Monsters. Not to be confused with War of the Monsters, which is the English version of Gamera vs. Barugan, which is an entirely different kaiju franchise that I don't even want to touch yet. So, yeah. All of the different international versions can be extremely confusing. However, for an English speaker in America that is a massive Godzilla fan, the two most important and relevant versions of this film are the Japanese cut, the original one that's just known as Invasion of the Astro Monster, and the English dub, which is known as Monster Zero. Frankly, I don't have a preference either way, but I do think that Monster Zero is a very solid movie if you aren't a fan of subtitles. Like, dubs get kind of a bad rap, but I think that with this one, it's really, really well done. Overall, Invasion of the Astro Monster strikes a perfect balance between sci-fi intrigue and kaiju spectacle. At times, it feels like a blatant ripoff of Star Trek, but it's bizarre thinking about how it does in fact predate the iconic TV show. It might not have Godzilla front and center for most of the film, but you gotta remember, it's kind of a King Ghidorah movie more than anything. It is called Invasion of the Astro Monster. That's King Ghidorah in the title. But the pacing and focus on the aliens and the monsters just keeps this whole movie engaging regardless. It's a standout entry in the Showa era, and despite some minor quibbles, it remains one of the more entertaining films in the franchise. With all of that out of the way, I'm Cole McCormick, you're watching Firewood Media. This is part 6 of my massive Godzilla retrospective project. If you're new to the channel, go and check out the first 5 parts. I also covered the MonsterVerse Godzilla movies, so feel free to go check those out as well. Anyways, I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.